Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Office 365 Dev Pulse Show. I'm your host, Scot Hillier, and today we're going to be talking about Angular 2 and developing for SharePoint and Office 365. Before we get started on any of that, though, I just want to make sure we take a second to thank our host, Microsoft. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do this show, so as always, many thanks to them. And also, before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and post some links to some reference material in the chat window so that everyone has the references that I'll be referring to throughout. They should be there in the chat window now, links to the various articles and sites that I'll reference as we go along. Okay, so let me go ahead and just do a little bit of screen share here so we can get rolling. We're working off of a new platform for this show too, so hopefully we won't have too many bumps along the way. Okay, great. So a couple of things before we go ahead and get started here. The material that I'm doing here, recently Angular 2 has moved into the beta phase, right? So a lot of us have been watching Angular 2 for quite some time, and here's the announcement right here on Angular 2 beta. So a lot of us have been watching Angular 2 for quite some time. And really, as it moves into beta, I think that means it's time to start to take it seriously. As they say in the beta announcement here, they really feel like reaching beta means that you can develop against Angular 2, that it's now stable enough for us to go ahead and use. So time to really start learning it. And what I'm going to do for you today is, some beta material. So I have a workshop that I'm putting together as part of the work that I'll be doing throughout the year. And I'm taking some material from that workshop that I'm putting together, and we're just going to spend the next hour going over some of that basic material and seeing where we are with Angular 2, SharePoint, and Office 365 development right now. If you're interested in getting more than just, an hour on the Office 365 Dev Pulse, we're going to be doing more material on the Unity Connect Online event. So February 8th through 11th, we're going to have Unity Connect Online. It's an online conference. We're going to have development, business, power user, IT content throughout the week, but you can expect to see some Angular 2 there as well. And of course, at our big event in Amsterdam, Unity Connect in Amsterdam, we'll have an all-day workshop. And I'll have some other venues throughout the year that I'll be doing an all-day workshop on this content. So again, if you're interested in this content, stay close to the IT Unity site and look for those workshops that we're going to be doing throughout the year. Okay, great. With that said, let's go ahead and bring up my slide deck here. So again, what I've got here for you is information, materials from the workshop that I'm working on. So I'm going to kind of pick and choose as we go along. There's probably a lot more material here than we could reasonably get through in an hour. But my idea here is to pick and choose from what I've got to give you a good understanding of how Angular 2, SharePoint, Office 365 development fits together. So here's my agenda for the broader workshop that I'm working on, talking about enterprise JavaScript, the Angular 2 framework, security permissions, and of course SharePoint and Office development. I think what's important for what we're going to do here today is to understand that some of the material when it comes to Angular 2 and SharePoint is old, and by that I mean it's things that we've already talked about. So my end goal for this hour is to get to an application that uses implicit OAuth flow to authenticate against Azure Active Directory and retrieve some information from SharePoint. So when I say some of it is old, I mean that we've been using implicit flow previously to access SharePoint and get some information when we were doing Angular 1.x applications. So I don't intend to cover that in tremendous detail. We're going to visit the key spots. I'm going to go into Azure Active Directory, show the application definition, go to SharePoint, show the list that I'm talking to, that kind of thing. But I'm going to try to really focus on the things that are new that you need to understand in order to be successful reaching that point where you can utilize implicit flow against SharePoint. And I should also point out, even though I'm going to be doing SharePoint things here, the pattern that we're following, you'll understand will work for all kinds of things, not just SharePoint Online. So any of the APIs that are available in Azure Active Directory, you can use this exact same pattern to talk to those as well. In fact, I'll point out to you here, another useful resource that I pasted into the window is this one right here. Richard Dizagera did a great article on Angular 2 and the Microsoft Graph. So he went through the process of using Angular 2 to talk to the Graph endpoint, which is a great exercise. What's different between what Richard did in his blog article and what I'll be doing for you today is that Richard went through the OAuth process, the implicit flow process. He went through that step by step and sort of manually put that together in his solution. I'm going to be using the Active Directory authentication library for JavaScript in my solution. So I'm going to be using the same library that we were using under Angular 1.x in Angular 2. So showing you how to take that in and use it in Angular 2. So that's a great resource, though, for you to check out. And also, here's another good resource that we probably won't have a chance to touch on, but not only can we use the patterns that I'm using today to talk to SharePoint Online, other endpoints like the Microsoft Graph, we could also use them to make Office add-ins. So here's a link to an article I wrote a little while ago up on IT Unity about building an Excel 2016 Office add-in using the Angular 2 beta. In this particular article, I stuck with straight up JavaScript, didn't introduce any TypeScript contents rather. So you'll get sort of a plain view of what Angular is in the JavaScript world by looking at this article, but also learn a little bit how you could create Office add-ins for it. Okay, great. So that's some of the work that's gone on to date and some good references for you. Let's go ahead and return to my slides here and talk a little bit about what I consider to be the new fundamental material you have to know to be successful with Angular 2. So everything in my mind starts with enterprise JavaScript. And in particular, some of the new improvements in enterprise JavaScript that we're beginning to see come out of the ECMAScript 2015 specification, or what was called ES6, right? So ECMAScript 2015 or ES6, ECMAScript 6. These are some of the key things that we're going to need in order to be successful. ECMAScript 2015 has varying levels of compatibility. If you're interested in the particular compatibility of the browsers that you're targeting, you can see the link there to the Kangax site where you can see the compatibility tables for all the different browsers. Key thing I think at this point to understand is that you do not have full ECMAScript 2015 support in any of the browsers. Everything is in some form of support, some more, some less. And so what it means is that in order to be successful with Angular today, we're going to need some help in making these features a reality. Things like polyfills or ultimately TypeScript that will allow us to write something that feels very much like we're using ES6, but will ultimately compile to something that's cross-platform and probably in ES5 format. If you're interested in all the features that ES6 has to offer, you can see the link there for the various features, and I've listed them all here. We're not going to have time to go through all these different features, but a couple of them are very important to us in order to move ahead. So I picked on a couple of things that we'd like to look at, the first being classes. So in ECMAScript 2015, today, right now, you have broad support in the browsers that are available today for the idea of creating classes. So here you can see that I'm creating a class person. That class has a constructor that takes a first and last name and then sets the first and last name properties of the classes using the values passed into the constructor. And it also provides a method called speak that simply uses those values to return the string my name is, filling in those various values. You can also see one of my favorite ECMAScript features here, the string templates. You can see I have this backtick and then $sign with the curly braces, and this allows me to create a string using variables without having to go through all that nonsense of using the plus sign and quotes everywhere. So I like that. That's one of my favorites for cleaning up the JavaScript. So once you have a class, then you can make use of that class. You can see down here that I have var p equals new person, and I've passed in a first and a last name, and then I can say p.speak. So great. So we're moving along to something that feels more like we're using objects and classes in JavaScript. That's a big win, and we can do that now. We can also today take advantage of inheritance. So you can see here that I'm creating a class called customer that is extending the person, and then I have a constructor that takes the first name and last name from the person that we had before, but also accepts title, company, and email. The way that I address the class that I'm extending here is using the super keyword. So I say super, first and last name, and that creates my person under the covers. And then I can say this.title, this.company, this.email, which will now give me my customer. And now I'm having a customer.talk, a talk method that's returning super.speak. So what I said before in the person, and then appending on I work for this company. You can see I can then create a new customer into the variable C, pass in all the various arguments, and ask for talk. So that's great. We can do that today. So those are some powerful things we're going to need to make use of Angular going forward. The real key thing that's new in JavaScript that everyone has to understand to be successful with Angular is the idea of a module. So modules are not new in JavaScript, but for a lot of people who have been doing JavaScript, implementing them is going to be something new. They've been floating around in various forms for a while, but still I don't see a lot of widespread adoption of the module approach with SharePoint developers. So let's talk a little bit about what modules are. Modules are a way to encapsulate the code that you write in JavaScript. Now, I had been teaching these for a while now as what we call internal modules. So when you create an internal module, it gives you a way to encapsulate code and ensure that you don't pollute the global namespace. So keeping the JavaScript code that you write out of the window object and in your own object. When you have internal modules like this, really the hallmark of them, the way that you know you've got them, is that you're loading them through a script tag. So if you're doing a lot of enterprise JavaScript work, then you might have that home page that has like 50 script tags on it, and you've broken all of your JavaScript up into different files, but now you've got 50 script tags in the home page referencing all those different libraries. So you're probably using internal modules if you're doing that kind of thing. What we're moving to is we're moving away from the idea of these internal modules and more towards what are called external modules. The difference between internal and external modules is that external modules are loaded on demand when they're needed using some kind of async module loader component that reaches out for that JavaScript file and loads it on demand. This is really important because what it allows us to do is really break down our project into tiny pieces, into reusable components. So you're going to, if you haven't already, you're going to begin to hear over and over now about component development in JavaScript and the idea of creating these small reusable chunks that can be loaded when they're needed and not all having references on the, the index.html page. Here's a classic example of an internal module. You can see here that what I've done is I've created a namespace called wingtip as an object and then attached my customer definition to my wingtip object, giving me basically a namespace with some kind of module inside of it. And then it's also important to point out that I'm using this self-executing function in order to create that customer object. Now, if you're not familiar with this syntax, I can't go into it in great detail in just our 1 hour, but this is what people are doing today. This is classic internal module syntax. This is known as the revealing module pattern. And here you can see that I can do something like wingtip.customer.speak. So internal modules are great for encapsulating code and allowing me to keep my JavaScript from polluting the global namespace. And again, we can do it today. When it comes to external modules, we can do external modules today. Again, the key difference here is we're not using script tags and we're not loading all of our JavaScript at once. When I create these external modules, what I'm trying to do is store a module in a separate file. So a one-to-one mapping between a file and a module that I create. Now in ECMAScript 5, ES5, we can do this today, and there are a couple of popular ways to do it. One is on the server side using what's known as the common JS format. So when we talk about formats, it's how are you structuring that module, and then there's some kind of module loader that's looking for a certain structure so it can import your module into the solution. So one format is common JS, which is typically used with the Node.js, and it's for server-side JavaScript. Another popular one is the AMD format, which is used with the require module loader. So that's typically client-side. So these things are being done already. They were being done before Angular 2 reached its beta stage. This is what people were doing with ECMAScript 5. But again, a lot of SharePoint developers were not loading modules, and so now this becomes something really important that we need to do. In ECMAScript 6, in ECMAScript 2015, ES6 or 2015, initially we're trying to create a module loader standard for ES6. But actually what happened is it didn't make it. So it got separated out into a separate effort known as the JavaScript loader standard, separated from that ECMAScript 2015 standard, and it eventually is going to use what's known as the system format. So you're going to hear about common JS, AMD, and the system format. So the goal is to reach a common format using a system object that's supported by all browsers. Today, we don't have that support. Chrome and Firefox are in progress with that, and in Edge, it's just under consideration. So today, we don't have that standard system object to do module loading. So what you're going to find is that to do Angular 2 development, today you're going to use a polyfill. So you're going to use something called the ES6 loader polyfill that will give you that system behavior even though your browser doesn't support it yet. When you do get to ES6, here's the idea in the future of what things might look like. What you'll do is create something like a person.js file that exports a person class. And then in order to use it in another file, like in this case something called app.js, you would say import the person from person. Notice the from person in quotes there. That refers to the file person.js, but we never include the file extensions. And that actually becomes important when we start to work with TypeScript. But you can see that you're basically just importing that class. And then once you import it, you can just go ahead and create a new person from there. So you've broken up your code into separate modules that are being loaded declaratively. In the future, you'll also be able to load dynamically using the system loader. So here you can see I'm exporting the person class and then using system.import to import programmatically. Now, all of this stuff will be in the future for support. So today what we have is you have a lot of people using, for example, require and the AMD module loading standard. Here, we're making use of the require JS library, and it gives us a module that we're going to kick off in the scripts app directory. And so what it's going to do is run this app.js first when you load. So you basically are going to make one script tag, and then everything else is dynamic. So what it does is it ensures that certain files like the customer file are available, like customer.js are available. And then it will load that file dynamically and make it available like this, customer.speak. Inside the customer, you can see that I'm creating the class to export here. So when I'm using today in ECMAScript 5 require.js, I have to follow a certain standard for the creation of my modules so that require is able to load them dynamically. So again, people are doing that today. If I want to do things like they will be done in ES6, I can make use of the ES6 module loader polyfill, which is going to allow me to write that magical code system.import, right? That's the target we're all headed towards, system.import. And here you can see that I'm going to import a module.js. And once I import that, then I can go ahead and make use of that module. And so it's really just the same kind of dynamic loading, but it's happening in using a different loader. And again, the idea is to get away from third-party loaders and into something that's more common. Okay, so let's take a look at some classes and modules. And I'm going to come in here and just go ahead and run a sample that I have here. And the sample itself, not going to be too wildly exciting. Just going to show us some classes and modules, and then we'll take a look at some of the code. So go ahead and here and get it started up. It's coming. Okay, there we go. And fire up a browser. And all right. So here's our modules demo. Again, not too exciting, but if I come in here and I click on internal, I've got an example of some internal modules. Again, I have that person I created that says, hello, my name is Scot Hillier, and then the customer that inherits from it. I could also do it with require. So here I'm using AMD modules and the popular require module loader to accomplish the same thing. My name is Scot Hillier, and then there's the customer talk. I can also do it with the ES6 module loader polyfill. Here's the person. Here's the customer. Okay, so my point here in showing this to you is that from the outside looking in, we really can't tell the difference between internal, the popular require that's used today, and the ES6 loader that we'll use in the future. If we come into the code, though, we can see the differences. So let's start with the internal ones. Here's an example of an internal module. This is an internal module, again, using the module patterns that we're all familiar with to be able to export an internal module. There's our person, and here's our customer that's extending the first module like that. And then if I go look at the code that calls this, it's in the internal page where you can see that I'm making direct script references to those modules. So direct script references likely means you're using internal modules. And then I just go down here and you can see now that I have those direct script references, I can create a new person. I can create a new customer. All right, that's internal modules. If we look at the AMD ones, I've got a require module, and the require module is also using a person, but you can see the form of this is different. Down here it says exports.person. So this is the AMD format for the person, the AMD format for the customer. And if we look at the require web page, you'll see that I have a script reference to the require.js library. So I'm using that third-party module loader. It expects a certain form of the module, and then what I can do is load those dynamically. So here I'm loading the require module 1 and the require module 2 dynamically, which allows me to create a person and allows me to create a customer. Great. Finally, we can look at the ES6 modules. So here's an ES6 module that creates a person. Notice it's a little cleaner than what was going on with require. I like this a lot better with the export function. It's not wrapped by something that looks like this with the define and the callback function. So the ES6 module loader, much nicer. This looks better for me. And then here's my customer that's exporting. And then if we look at the ES6 page, we'll see that what I've done is I've got a reference to the ES6 module loader available for me to use, and then I simply use code like this to import those modules dynamically as I need them. Okay, so that's a lot to cover quickly about modules, but the takeaway here is that the module stuff is really critical to properly understanding Angular 2. The next thing that's super critical to understanding Angular 2 is the use of TypeScript. So TypeScript has kind of been on the sidelines for a while. I mean, it's been around for a few years now, but it's been something that folks have been trying to get us to use, but it hasn't really gained tremendous traction until a really interesting thing happened. And that was that the Angular 2 team decided to use TypeScript as the primary tool to create it, and it's been set up so that really TypeScript is the ideal way to develop in Angular 2. So what is TypeScript? If you haven't fooled around with TypeScript before, it's a type superset of JavaScript that will transpile into plain JavaScript. So we're going to be writing files that have TS extensions, but they will transpile down to JS files. Now we can pick the ECMAScript version like ES5 or ES6 that we want to transpile to. It's going to be cross-browser compatible so that when we transpile, we get something that's going to run on lots of different browsers. And we can take advantage of ES6 type constructs today and get transpiling down to ES5 cross-browser compatible stuff. So TypeScript is super exciting. If you don't know it, this has got to go on your list of things to learn. Quickly, why we care about it. TypeScript brings lots of stuff to us, as I said, but not just the ability to create cross-browser JavaScript and to take advantage of ECMAScript's 6 things today. It also tries to fix a number of weaknesses that JavaScript has. So for example, we get static typing. Here you can see that I'm able to write JavaScript that has scoping keywords like private, and it also declares data types like a string for this input and a string for the return value from this method. You can also see down here the scoping and the value for a property. So static typing is a real important and key part of TypeScript and how it works with Angular 2. I can create classes in TypeScript. So here you can see I'm creating a class. I get the class keyword, but look, I also get scoping keywords like private and public. So if you just pause for a second and really appreciate the simplicity and the beauty and the power of this, and just thinking this is how you're going to write JavaScript now, it really makes a very strong case for TypeScript. Along with the classes, we also get interfaces. So here you can see I'm defining an interface called welcome data, and then I can specify that my method has to return that interface. And I get IntelliSense during the development process, and I get error checking during the transpiling process. So much more powerful, much more professional kind of development than I would do with straight JavaScript alone. In TypeScript, I also have the concepts of modules. So I can create internal modules very easily by just using the module keyword and exporting the things that I want, like the classes, and then making use of those classes. But we also get external modules, which is why I spent so much time talking about this, is that this is where it all comes together, TypeScript and the concept of external modules. So now what I can do is I can create separate files like wingtip.ts where I export a module called wingtip that has a class called welcome. And then I can go to some other TypeScript file like app.ts and write this really nifty line of code, import wingtip from wingtip, and then it will make the exported class welcome available to me, and then I can say something like var vm equals new wingtip.welcome. Now, I want to pause here and really ask you to look at this and let it sink in, because where we've arrived at now with TypeScript is we're writing something that feels a lot more familiar to us. We're writing classes, and then we're importing namespaces into our project that we need from external sources or ones that we create ourselves. Pause for just a second and really appreciate that that's basically exactly what you do with C#. So you can take all the libraries from the .NET framework, import the ones you want into your C# project, and then make use of all those libraries. Or you can write your own libraries, import those into your C# project, and make use of them. We're doing the same thing here with JavaScript. We can now make use of external modules or our own modules that we create and get that same professional development experience. What I noticed there's a couple of questions. I think what I'm going to do is press on a little bit here just because we are so limited in time. And when I get to the end, I'll try to look at the question queue here and see what we've got. But what I want you to really appreciate is just that we've gotten to a place now where I'm writing JavaScript using the same ideas that I write my C# code with. All right. So let's go ahead then and return back to our project, and let's close all these windows. And now let's take a look at what this looks like in TypeScript. So I have all these different ways that we did it. We showed a demo. We showed internal modules. We showed require.js. We showed the ES6 module loader. And now let's take a look at TypeScript. So I'm going to talk a little bit about TypeScript support in the project in just a minute, but all the TypeScript support I need is in here at the moment. And you'll notice that I have a couple of different TypeScript files in here. They have TS in front of them. So I've got a person, a customer, and this boot one. Let's go ahead and open up person.ts. And here when I open up person.ts, you can see that I have an export. The class is person. I have some private data members, first name and last name. I have a constructor, and I have a method here. So this should look, I mean, one look at this, and you should just want to write TypeScript immediately, right? I mean, look at this. This is a beautiful way for us to be able to write JavaScript. And so now what I can do is this export is in one file, person.ts. Now what I can do is come to a customer TS and say import person from the person file. And then I can make use of the person that got imported by saying export class customer extends person, where I've got private data members. I've got a constructor. I'm referencing using the super keyword. I'm referencing my person. And then I've got a talk method that is extending super.speak. And you can see here how clean this is. And hopefully you really get the idea now of why modules are important. Then for this application, I have this third TypeScript file called boot. And what boot does is it simply imports both the person and the customer. And all it's going to do is wire up the button event handler. So you can see that I'm doing a document.query selector and looking for the button called person speak and customer talk and handling the click event. Okay, and then I also love this syntax right here, the new arrow syntax. This is basically your inline function right here. So this is the function that will get called when it's clicked, and you can see all we're doing is calling the speak or the talk function. Now, to me, when I look at this, this is much cleaner way to write JavaScript. It works the way my programming brain wants to work, and this is really the reason why you should care about TypeScript. But it goes beyond that now, because this pattern of development is what the Angular 2 team took and ran with. So this is exactly the way that we're going to write with Angular. And basically what we're going to do is, instead of just importing our own stuff like person and customer, we'll be able to import components from the Angular framework and make use of those. Okay, so let's zip on back to the slides now, and now let's talk about Angular 2. Okay, so again, we're pretty pressed for time here on just having an hour, and I'm pretty sure I could do about 40 hours talking about Angular 2. So I'm going to do a pretty quick introduction, and then what we're going to do is take a look at writing an Angular 2 app and then try to move right into getting something rolling in SharePoint. So Angular 2 is still a single page or SPA framework implementing what we call the MV star pattern. When I taught Angular 1, I used to talk about model view controller, and Angular 1 had controllers. Angular 2 has components, and the components sort of play that role that the controller played previously. We could have a huge debate, probably way beyond the scope of what we can do here, about why we needed to move from Angular 1 to Angular 2, but there are some easy things to say right away. We got some significant improvements in speed in Angular 2. We're able to use the latest JavaScript innovations that we've already talked about, components and modules, and there's better mobile support built in, and lots of other things too, but just a couple of things to keep in mind as we go. All right, let's just move on to this slide here. Again, just going to pick and choose a little bit to show you some key concepts. Here's MV star with Angular 2. Again, in Angular 1, we had something called a controller, but here we have a model view component, but the component kind of fills the same role that the controller did in Angular 1. It reads and writes to the data store, and then it populates a model with data from that data store, which is then sent off to the view for display. The major building blocks of Angular, again, that I think we could probably spend a week talking about, are modules and barrels, components and directives, templates and binding, services, and dependency injection. So I'm going to give about 30 seconds to each one of those. When it comes to modules and barrels, we've already talked about modules, so you can see here the idea of being able to export a class like this and create a custom module, but also we get Angular in the form of modules. So Angular, down here at the bottom, you can see I'm importing something called component from Angular 2 core. The way that Angular 2 is constructed is it's constructed as a module of modules, and those are known as barrels. So what you do is you import stuff from the Angular barrels that you want to make use of, but it follows the same ideas that we were following when we created our own modules. Components and directives are next. So this is probably the most important thing to understand about the core development of Angular is the creation of the component. What we'll do in Angular 2 is create a lot of components, and components are basically some form of functionality that is tied to a piece of the web page UI. So what we're going to do here is import the component from the Angular 2 barrel, and then we can define the component and associate it with some kind of selector that's on the HTML page, and then specify the HTML that should be injected into the area, pardon me, where the selector is defined. So in this case, we've got something simple. We're looking for a selector in the web page called app main, and we're going to inject something called welcome.getMessage into it. We have lots of ways to do binding. You can see a couple of examples here. We've got a structural directive that adds elements to the DOM. So simply put here, this structure that says ng4, every item in items, will create a TR, like a row in a table, for everything that's in, say, an array. And then down here, we have a straight up binding, two-way binding using something called ngModel. The key takeaway here is that what components and directives do is they modify the DOM in your web pages. So you're going to have dynamic functionality in components that drive what gets displayed in your application, very similar to what we did with controllers in Angular 1. There are lots of important built-in directives. I showed you some of them in the previous slide. But I think I'd like to do is let's go ahead and do a hello world in Angular and see what that looks like. Okay. Let's go ahead and open the project here. And we're just going to do a very simple hello Angular. This guy is already built up. So let's just go ahead and run it. Going to be super simple. I'll fire it up. Wait for the server to start. There it goes. All right, so there you go. Super exciting. There's our hello world right there. Let's go back and take a look at how that's done. Okay, so one of the things that's important here is the setup of your ASP.NET application. What I'm doing is I'm using an ASP.NET 5 application, and I've set it up so that it works with Node. In fact, let's go ahead and just walk through these steps real quickly. If I wanted to start a new project, I could come in and say File, New, Project. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new ASP.NET web application. Click OK. And then I'm going to select to create a new empty ASP.NET 5 application. No authentication. And click OK. This is going to set up a basic web application for me in ASP.NET 5, and you can see my root right here at www.root. Okay. Now, what I'm doing is I'm serving up static pages because this is all client-side development. So what I have to do is come in and change the configuration. So I'm just going to come into the startup configuration and say use static files. And then load up the static file capabilities for ASP.NET 5. Give it a second to do that. Right? Good. Now, the reason that I'm using ASP.NET 5 is because the Angular team is making all of their barrels, all their pieces of Angular available using the Node Package Manager, or NPM. So I need a project that supports NPM. Now, lots of developers might want to use Microsoft Code, right? They use Visual Studio Code. And I know a lot of people are doing that, but I like to see if I can get this thing to go in the full version of Visual Studio, because I like Visual Studio. I like all the tools that are available in Visual Studio. There's lots of tools for SharePoint developers there, and I don't want to leave it. So my goal was to get all this working inside of Visual Studio. So now that I've got this in place, what I'm going to do is come in and add a JSON file that's going to pull down packages from NPM. So the Node Package Manager. So I'm going to add the package.json, and then I actually have a little JSON here already that we can make use of. Paste that in. And you can see the dependencies that I'm downloading. The Angular 2 library, system.js for our dynamic module loading, the ES6 polyfills that allow ES5 browsers to use all the ES6 capability. I've got libraries in here that allow me to do reactive programming using something called observables, which is another whole topic. Observables are the new promise in Angular development. The zone, which is an execution zone, which controls the context of my execution, and then also good old Bootstrap and jQuery in here. And then what happens is if I save these and you look over here under my www root in the solution, what's going to happen is all of these things are going to get downloaded. I can see it going on down here in the output window, that it's going to download all of these things from the Node Package Manager just exactly the same way that when we work in Visual Studio that we download from other package managers like NuGet. And if I wait here long enough, it'll emerge inside of the project. It takes just a few seconds for that to happen. And then what I'll be able to do after that is I'll also be able to add a TypeScript configuration to the project that will dictate my TypeScript compile configuration. So what language do I want, ES5, ES6, you know, that type of thing, how I'm going to target it. So let's give it a second here. It looks like it's just about done. Does take a second to pull all these down, so I'm not surprised with the slight delay, but we'll give it a second. Hopefully you should finish. I'm going to probably lose faith in it and just open the other one that I've got. Let's open up that hello one that we had. And we can see the end result from here. Checking back on the other. Okay, great. So we can see that now we have this folder called Node Modules. And inside the Node Modules, we've got all the packages that we downloaded. So it goes into this folder called Node Modules, and then they all become available to your project, which is similar to a lot of package managers that we use. Now I'm going to go ahead and close this one. And let's return to the one that we were using before, where you can also see I have that same Node Modules folder. So that gets me set up. Now, the other thing that I've done here is I've added this tsconfig.json file, and you can see my compiler options here. So this is dictating how my TypeScript gets transpiled into JavaScript. The key things I want to point out are that we're targeting ES5. So we know ES6 support is not full in the browsers that we have today, so we'll be targeting ES5. And the module system that I'm going to use is system. So it could be CommonJS, it could be AMD, but in Angular 2, we're using the system module loader. So that's what I want. I want it to take the form of the system module loader. Now I'm all set. So now what I can do is come in and create my first Angular component. All right, so here I'm going to go ahead and import component from Angular 2 core. Now, Angular 2 core came down with my NPM modules, and it's available in the node_modules folder, and that's how TypeScript knows how to find it. The next thing I'm going to do is import a module I created from app.module, which is this file right here, which is just exporting the welcome. So we're showing in this example how you can create a custom component and a custom module rather, and import modules from Angular. Then what you do is you create an Angular component, and that's what the component class does. You specify the selector and the HTML that will be injected there. When we go look at our index.html, you'll see that we have some libraries that we're referencing. So the basic libraries that I downloaded with NPM are being referenced here. And then there is an initializing script that configures the system module loader and tells it that it can find all of its stuff in the app folder, which I've got in my project. And then it tells it to bootstrap the application by using the boot file. And here's what boot looks like. the boot file imports the app component that we had just created and the bootstrap from Angular and simply calls bootstrap on that component. And basically what that means is this component will be the first component to run. Okay, so that's a lot. That's a fire hose, but there are some key things to keep in mind here. In order to get this to work, I had to configure my ASP.NET 5 environment to support NPM so I could use the Node Package Manager to get my Angular stuff because that's how the team is delivering it. But that same environment also allowed me to specify how I wanted TypeScript to create my JavaScript. And in fact, if you look underneath the TypeScript files in the project, you'll see there's a transpiled JavaScript file, and you notice how it's using system. So this is the system form of the module that's expected by the system loader. So all of that I got for the setup that I did. But now, once all that kind of plumbing and infrastructure is in place, now I'm free to go ahead and just write my Angular components in TypeScript and go to town. Okay, so now we need to get to the finale here of what we're trying to do, which is to actually talk to SharePoint. And so the last thing to really understand in order to get to that point is to talk about services and dependency injection. So just like in Angular 1, in Angular 2, we have the idea of services. And what services are available across components. So what we're doing is taking common, important functionality and putting it in a service, and then that service can be injected into a component so that a component can use it. And that's important because a single service could be injected into many components. So services give you a way to factor out functionality that can be used across many components. There are also built-in services in Angular 2, just like there were in Angular 1. The critical one for us is going to be the HTTP service that is going to allow us to make a REST call, because that's exactly what we want to do if we're going to talk to SharePoint or the Microsoft Graph or really anything else that Azure Active Directory offers us. Another key thing, though, in services that will be beyond the time frame that we have here today is the idea of observables. I'm going to show them to you in action. You'll see them a little bit, but again, we could do a lot more detail on them. Observables are the new promises. They're much better than promises because they actually allow you to update over and over and over again. So you could, for example, provide a stream of information that's coming from the back end as opposed to just a one-shot, which you typically get with a promise. Okay, so what we do when we create the service then is a service in Angular is really just a class. So we're going to create a class and export it like this my service. And then we're going to inject it into a component. So here's a component, and we have a providers definition that says what providers are available, and that's how we're injecting it into the component. And then in the construction process, we're going to get a new instance of the service to use. As I said, we also get built-in services like Angular's HTTP service, which is the one that we'll be using here in just a moment. But the HTTP service allows us to do gets and puts and posts. So here you can see some simple code that's doing a get, in this case against the old Northwind data point to retrieve some products and returning that value. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the whole thing in action here. I'm going to open up a project that uses implicit flow to talk to a list in SharePoint Online, Office 365. And while this thing is coming up, let's just take a look at a couple of things here. The first thing I'm going to do is just bring you into my Office 365 environment. And here in Office 365, you can see that I have a very simple announcements list with one and only one announcement that says Azure AD is live. So our goal is to read from that list. Now, if I go into my Azure environment, here in Azure Active Directory, I have an application defined here called Angular 2 Implicit Flow. And inside of Azure Active Directory, I've given this application full control over all site collections in SharePoint Online. Now, the idea of defining implicit flow, defining applications in Azure Active Directory is another whole topic that we could cover. And I'm skimming over it here because, as I said at the beginning, it's not new information. We were doing this in Angular 1. If it's new to you, you have some additional things to look at. But what I want you to understand is that we have made an entry in Azure Active Directory for our application, and we have requested the permissions to have full control over the site collection, which is going to give me what I need to read a simple list. So that part is all done. And in fact, what I'd like to do is go ahead and run this first just to prove that we can do it, and then we'll come back and take a look at the code that made it work. So let's go ahead and fire this up. Coming. Okay, here's my application. All right, so you can see here that I have a very simple application. Let's go ahead and clear out the history on this so we can start from the beginning. It's just got a cookie in it from having logged in before, so let's go ahead and reload it. Okay, so now you can see that I've got this very simple application, Angular 2 implicit flow, demonstrating our implicit flow with Angular 2, and it's inviting me to log in. So I'm using implicit flow, which is going to allow me to get an access token for this application through the process of logging in. So what's going to happen now when I click login is I'll be redirected to the normal Azure Active Directory login screen, as we would expect with implicit flow. And I'm just simply going to log in with my normal Office 365 organizational account. Okay. And after I log in, I'm going to get kicked back to my application where I will now have an access token. You can see it's inviting me to log out, but I also can come here and click on this profile link, and you can see that it knows who I am now, right? So what I'm proving here is that I actually did log in to Azure Active Directory. My application knows who I am, but we can go further now. I can go ahead and click on announcements, and we're going to make a RESTful call off to that same announcements list that I showed you before. You can see, of course, it says Azure AD is live. So that is exactly the same announcement that we had over here. Azure AD is live. So we are, in fact, proving that we were able to read that SharePoint list. Let's take a look at how it happened. Okay, in order to make this happen, I set up the application exactly the same way that I did in the example I showed you before, and all I'm doing now is writing TypeScript classes. It begins by writing a service. So our first stop is going to be in this file right here, which is the list service. The list service is designed to make that RESTful call over to SharePoint. So in the list service, I want you to see that I am importing from Angular 2 the HTTP service. So just like Angular 1, Angular 2 has a built-in HTTP service that we can take advantage of for making RESTful calls. What's different between Angular 1 and Angular 2 is that in Angular 2, we're returning an observable from this call as opposed to a promise, which is what happened in Angular 1. So I'm going to create a class called list service, and then if you look down here in the constructor of my class, you'll see that I'm expecting an HTTP, that's this object here, the HTTP service, to be injected. Now, I have declared that my service allows other services to be injected into it. And then in my constructor, I've specified that I want an HTTP service injected. So the bottom line is that Angular is going to give me an instance of the HTTP service, which I will then store in my own private variable called HTTP service. Now what I can do is come down to a method I created called getItems, and this is going to return an observable. Inside of here, I can go ahead and make a call using the HTTP service, and I'm just going to do a get, and I'm going to set up the headers. I'm going to ask for JSON back, and here we see the very familiar authorization bearer and looking for a token. So what we need is that access token. And so here the service is really nothing more than a call to the HTTP service, but it needs to retrieve this access token. So this access token is retrieved in a separate class called the authorization class, or auth class. If I go and look at the auth class, inside of the auth class, what we're doing is we're providing the key information to create a context that will allow logging into Azure Active Directory. Now, I am simply using here the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADL, in much the same way that I used ADL before in Angular 1. So again, not something new here, although we could spend a lot of time talking about Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. But basically what it does is it wants to know the tenant that you're logging into, the client ID, and where should I go after you successfully log out, and where is the information going to be stored that I get. And what happens here is that this authentication class is going to redirect you up, as you saw, to log into Azure Active Directory. And after you log into Azure Active Directory, you'll be issued an access token, and that access token is going to be stored inside of local storage. And the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library is going to then take over managing that. So you can see, for example, that I get built-in login and log out functions that come directly from that library. And then I can get my access token from storage by creating a new authentication context and then calling the acquire token method. If I've acquired a token from login, then it's simply going to read it from local storage. Otherwise, I could be redirected. So the key thing to understand here is that I've embodied all of the implicit flow functionality from ADL.js in this one class to sort of wrap it up. And then my list service really needs to do nothing more than to ask for the token from the auth class and put it in the header right here. Now what happens is I'm going to go ahead and execute that call to the endpoint, which in this case is my SharePoint endpoint, and then it's going to return an observable. Now, the way observables work is that observables allow you to subscribe to them so that you can receive information when they change. So just like you did with a promise, you'd get a promise back and then wait for that promise to fulfill. You get an observable back, but you subscribe to its results, and then you're going to receive the results back when the next method is called. If there's an error, the error method gets called. The way this looks when you're consuming it can be seen here in the announcements component, where I inject my list service, and then inside the announcements component, all I have to do is call listService.getItems. So once I've embodied all that information in there, it's a simple matter of just calling the public method I made, getItems. GetItems returns an observable to me. I subscribe to the results of that observable. When the results come back to me, I can do whatever I want with them. And here what I'm doing is creating an array of items with a title and a body in them. My array of items is part of my announcements component. My announcements component will display that array of items using the template that's found in list.html. If I go to list.html, we can see that it's a simple HTML table that uses the ng4 construct to loop through every item that's in that array and produce a row. And that's why we were able to see the announcements inside of a table. Okay, so that's really a tremendous fire hose that happens inside of just the hour here. As we go forward, again, I said I'm working on an all-day workshop. I think it probably takes that long to really get through this stuff in some detail that we're going to be making available through Unity Connect and through some workshops we'll be doing throughout the year at various conferences. I'm also going to be doing more authoring on this topic. So you can start by going up and taking a look at how to build the Excel add-in with Angular 2. But I'll be breaking down this particular project that I showed you into a series of articles that you can look at in more detail. And I'll make the code available on the IT Unity repository as well. Hopefully what you'll get out of this is just some of the foundational things that you now need to focus on in order to get to the point where you can write JavaScript applications using Angular 2 that take advantage of Azure Active Directory and endpoints like SharePoint Online. Okay, let's see. We could probably just take a quick look at Q&A here. Oh, great. Easy to do. The question is, where are the resources? I did post those in the chat window. So if you have the chat window available, you should see the resources that I posted in there. Yep, I can see them. They're up there. So please check those out, and everything's available to you there. Again, no chat window. Okay, I think you'd have to look for it. It should be around there somewhere. We can also try to post these up on IT Unity as well to make them available to you there. And again, this is really just intended for you guys to get a quick introduction to what's going on and see all the moving parts. I know there's a tremendous amount there, but we'll be breaking them down as we go. So I think we're kind of right at the end. I've run over just a little bit here to try to finish up. But let's see here. Yep. Okay, great. So I've run over a little bit just to try to finish up. Again, I want to thank you guys for spending some time with me here, and also, again, thank Microsoft for their sponsorship of what we're doing. We're going to continue this topic. This is probably the thing that I'm going to be working on most of the year, to bring all this together and to produce resources so that you guys can be successful with it. So look for more of Office 365 Dev Pulse. Look for more articles online. Check out the Unity Connect online event that we're having, and look for our workshops that we'll do later in the year. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.